Welcome back, Netrunner fans, to part 2 of my Chrome City review. In this section, we're going to be looking at all of the Corp cards in the pack. First up, we have a new ID for HB. This is Cybernetics Division, Humanity Upgraded. It's a Division type identity. It's 40-15. Each player's maximum hand size is reduced by 1. The first thing to mention about this is the first ID that has less than 45 cards and also has 15 influence. I'm hoping that this is going to be a general design change, that they're not going to print these smaller deck sizes with less influence. I think it's fair to say that having less than 15 influence is a massive penalty. I think all of the IDs that have had less than 15 influence have been extremely difficult to play because of the influence reduction, and it kind of doesn't matter how good the ID ability is. I think the perfect example of that is Next Design, whose ID ability is really strong. It lets you set up your board and draw cards really good, but that 12 influence is just so brutal, and pretty much everybody would rather play like Engineering the Future or something like that. With that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the ability. Reducing maximum hand size is going to be pretty awesome if you're trying to flatline the runner, and I think this could be the start of a deck that uses a different sort of flatlining approach, namely reducing the runner's maximum hand size to a negative number. Almost all of the flatline strategies that we've seen so far, in fact probably all of them, have been focused on doing damage that exceeds their hand size. But we can also flatline the runner by reducing their maximum hand size to a negative number. This might be one of the first ways that we can realistically do that in a deck, combining brain damage, this ID's ability, and then some other cards, including cards we're going to see in the pack. It's worth noting that this does affect us as well, so it's going to make our hand size 4 instead of 5. That's a pretty steep penalty, I would say, but I think there is going to be ways to play around that, and I think there might even be situations where it's to your advantage to be able to like discard agendas or things like that. I think in general, the reduced hand size is going to be the biggest reservation for me on playing this thing, but the increased consistency of having a little bit smaller deck maybe could be worth it. I think really we need to look at some of the other cards that are in this pack before we talk about this card further, but in general, I do think that this has some really strong potential as a flatline-oriented deck based around both brain damage, maybe some net damage, and maybe some meat damage as well. Next up, we have an agenda for HB. This is a 3-for-1 agenda called Self-Destruct Chips. It's a security type. The runner's maximum hand size is reduced by 1. This has some obvious synergy with the ID that we just looked at. Like I was saying, we're going to probably want to reduce their maximum hand size to a negative number through some combination of effects like this and brain damage. Now, there's going to be quite a few ways to do brain damage within HB. We've definitely got a lot of ice that gives us the opportunity to do brain damage, and we're going to see some stuff later in this pack that's going to also give us the ability to do some brain damage as well. So I think if you're trying to do this flatline-oriented strategy with Cybernetics Division, Self-Destruct Chips is going to absolutely be one of the cards that you're going to want to consider. This is going to be really powerful when it's scored, and even if it doesn't flatline the runner at the end of their turn, it's going to definitely make them have to play differently. They're going to maybe have to discard stuff they don't want to. It's going to make it harder for them to play things like Quality Time and Diesel because they're going to have to lose so many of the cards. So this, I don't think, is really that good in any deck that isn't trying to do this flatline thing I'm describing, but in that deck, I think this could potentially see some play. Next up, we have an HB piece of ice. It's called Lab Dog. It's 2 to res. It's a trap type, 0 strength with 2 influence. It has 1 subroutine. The runner trashes an installed piece of hardware. Trash Lab Dog. Trap type ice is a woefully unrepresented portion of the game in my opinion. I'd really like to see more trap ice like this that'll keep the runner on their toes and force us to kind of have the AI breakers. I think a lot of criminal rigs and a lot of the weaker rigs in Netrunner don't necessarily have any AI breakers, so they're going to run into these trap type ice and not have a solution. So if you're playing like Andy or Leela and you run into this and lose either Desperado or maybe like R&D interface, I see that being pretty punishing and setting you back quite a bit, especially since there's no way really to recur those cards. You're just going to be trying to draw into a new copy. Even if you have a good AI breaker like Ottman in your deck, you're probably not going to want to fetch it and use it just to break this thing. I think more realistically, Parasite is the only good solution to this thing, and is definitely a huge weakness. I will say with the popularity of Shaper right now, this card might make a little bit more sense since Shapers tend to play a lot of hardware, R&D interface, prepaid voice pad. They usually have Astrolabe or some kind of cheap console they install quickly. So in general, I think this card has a lot of potential to get value there. But man, the weakness to Parasite seems like a huge problem for this, like it's been with some of the other trap type ice. Another thing that is, I think, a pretty obvious weakness with this is that the runner gets to choose which piece of hardware they trash. So in a lot of cases, they might have some superfluous piece of hardware or have, at least a piece of hardware they're willing to lose versus losing like their R&D interface or something like that. So I think this is the type of card that could potentially see some play. It would definitely see a lot more play if it didn't have the two weaknesses I just talked about. But I like the idea of making more trap type ice that have some sort of quality effect like this. And I really wish that they would have just given it a little bit of strength, even at a higher res cost or something. Next up, we have a new region upgrade for HB. This is Oaktown Grid. It's 1 to res, 1 to trash, and it's 2 influence. The trash cost of cards installed in this server is increased by 3. Limit 1 region per server. Well, the first thing to mention maybe is that this will affect itself. So the trash cost of 1 is only going to be true if the card is not installed and rezzed. That said, trash cost of 1 in your R&D or HQ seems kind of like a problem to me. And the fact that this only affects cards installed in the server really is the nail in the coffin for me. I think if you could put this on one of your centrals and it would help protect like R&D or HQ, it would see a lot more play. But the fact that this is only going to help cards installed in the server seems like a pretty narrow use to me. So this is going to be best if you're stacking a whole ton of upgrades or just cards in general in one server. Like, I think it could maybe be good with something like, like red herrings, like that kind of server, where you're putting like red herrings, ash, maybe something else all in one server, and you're trying to score big agendas, maybe even mandatory upgrades or some really big agenda like that. I don't know, this card seems pretty iffy to me. I think that while there aren't a lot of amazing regions to play within HB, I don't necessarily think that you can get a ton of value out of this. I think maybe in the future, if we see HB decks that are installing 3 or 4 cards in a server, this could see a little bit more play. It's certainly a good tax if there's an incentive for the runner to have to get into the server. And even if you're using this as protection for like asset economy like Adonis, I could see it maybe being okay. But I think it's going to be hard to draw into this, get that server set up, and then use the Adonis or whatever with it. In the same way that like Breaker Bay Grid hasn't seen a tremendous amount of play, despite it having pretty good synergy with Adonis as well. So I don't know, this card I think could see some play, but I'm pretty iffy about it. The next card in the pack is also an upgrade for HB. He's a new sysop named Ryan Knight. He's 2 to res, 3 to trash. He's an upgrade sysop, and he's 2 influence. He has trash, do 1 brain damage. Use this ability only during a run on this server, and only if the runner has no unspent clicks. This guy pretty obviously fits into this hypothetical HB deck I've been talking about. This is going to be a new way to do a brain damage that isn't ice, and that's going to be really nice. It's also going to be a nasty surprise for somebody who hasn't played against the card or doesn't suspect it. I also would like to say that there's a lot of reasons within HB for the runner to spend clicks and have to spend clicks and want to spend clicks, especially the Bioroids. So this guy potentially could be pretty brutal. I can definitely see a situation where like you put him behind an Eli and your opponent wants to run that card to make sure it's not a 3-for-2 agenda. So they click through your Eli and then they get hit with this for a brain damage. That kind of thing is definitely possible and could definitely happen. It is a little expensive with the 2 cost and, the fact that you have to get him to the server and everything. But the 3 trash cost, I think, is really the thing that I like about this guy. He's not going to be a huge POS in your R&D or in your HQ. He's going to survive the trashing, probably, and then he's going to be able to either defend those servers or go into a remote like I was just talking about. So I think this card is potentially playable, but probably only in that type of deck I was talking about before. I could maybe see some Jinteki players being interested in this, like a PE style or just a generally a damage-oriented Jinteki style would really like some new ways to do brain damage. So this could maybe fit into those kind of strategies as well. I don't know, I think this is probably going to be mainly the Cybernetics division. Next up, we have a new piece of ice for Jinteki. This is Clairvoyant Monitor. It's a 4-to-res, 3-strength Code Gate Psi. It's 2 influence. It has 1 sub, which is you play the Psi game, and if you win, you place an advancement token on an installed card and end the run. Well, this isn't wildly good, but I do think that there's a little bit of playability to this card. First of all, we have plenty of pretty good code gates in Jinteki. We don't have a lot of unbelievably strong ones, but with Lotus Field and Yagura and a variety of other code gates, we have some pretty good ways to address that area of our ice. This thing, I think, really has the most synergy with some of the lesser used IDs. So I think this could be something that Nisei Division might want to play, since it's going to just be another way to initiate a Psi game on ice. And ice are going to be a recurring way to get Psi games going, so it's going to potentially maximize the ID ability. I think this also has some synergy with the Tenon Institute, because Tenon is going to have to play advanceable ice or just some type of card to use the Tenon ability, and this is going to be able to utilize this advancement token. That's definitely the strongest aspect of this ice, is the fact that you can advance an installed card. Now, there aren't exactly a lot of outlets for that. It's going to mainly just be advanceable ice or maybe something like Ronin. So I think that this is going to be a pretty specialized piece of ice where you're not going to really be able to capitalize on that in most decks. But I think maybe in either of the 2 ideas I was just talking about, this could see a little bit of play. This is an interesting piece of ice, and I'm not wildly excited about it, but I think it could see a little bit of play. Next up, we have another Jinteki piece of ice. This is called Lockdown. It's a 0-to-res, 5-strength code gate. It's 1 influence. It has 1 subroutine. The runner cannot draw cards for the remainder of this turn. This is the type of ice that I think Jinteki's kind of been plagued with for most of the existence of the game, which is a type of ice that's not really that good on its own, but could potentially have good interactions with either other ice or other card effects in your deck. So this is, I think, going to be best in like a flatline oriented strategy where you're trying to hit them for some net damage, and then they're not going to be able to draw any cards, and then you could potentially finish them with something like a couple neural EMPs. Now, that I don't see being something that you're going to easily be able to do. I think good players are going to probably not lose to this thing. And it's just kind of a rule of thumb to draw your cards earlier in the turn rather than later in the turn. So, I don't know. I think this card is not going to really see a lot of play. It maybe in certain flatline decks could see a little bit of surprise factor, but I think realistically this is the type of card that really only does something if the runner is playing poorly, and I think is not really going to give you a whole lot of value. It does have good stats, 5 strength code gate for 0, the 1 influence. You can't really ask for better than that. But the fact that this subroutine is only going to occasionally matter, now when it matters, it's going to probably kill him, but I think it's going to matter so infrequently that it's probably not going to be worth the deck slot. The next card is an NBN piece of ice. This is called Little Engine. It's a 5 to res 7 strength code gate, and it's 2 influence. It has 3 subroutines. The first 2 are End the Run, and the last subroutine is the runner gains 5 credits. Well, whether or not this card ends up seeing play, I really like the design of this. I think this is a really interesting design. So the main thing to say about this is it's going to be a monster piece of ice, 7 strength, 2 End the Run subroutine code gate before they get a breaker, and it's going to stop them cold. But then once they get a breaker, it's going to be pretty inexpensive to break because they're going to be able to let that last subroutine fire. So this potentially is going to be the type of ice where it's going to be really good in the early and mid game, and then in the late game, it's going to kind of suck. For example, with Gordian Blade, which I think is one of the most common code gate solutions, this is going to be 2, I think, to break because you're going to be able to gain the 5. Now, it is the case that you're going to have enough credits to be able to break this. So that's definitely a thing, right? Like if the runner only has 2 credits, they're not going to be able to break this. So they're going to have a pretty good sum of credits. It's just not going to cost that much if they have that initial seed money. So I like this because it's creating a lot of different opportunities based on game state for this ice to do something relevant. And it's also giving the runner some ways to play around the ice just inherent to it. I think that type of design encourages a lot of interaction and is just a good thing for the game. So I really like this piece of ice. I think it's got a lot of nice flavor, and I think that it could potentially be pretty good in the right deck just because it's a monster code gate that's fairly inexpensive, and I think it's the type of thing that NBN wouldn't mind having, that's for sure. Next up, we have a new agenda for Wayland. This is a 4-for-2 called Oaktown Renovation. It's an initiative type, and it's also public. That's a new one. Install Oaktown Renovation face up. I'm assuming that's the public part. Whenever you advance Oaktown Renovation, gain 2 credits, or gain 3 credits if there are 5 or more advancement tokens on it. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the public aspect. I assume we're going to see more than one agenda of this type in the future, and I think that's just a really good design idea overall. Just the idea that we're going to have agendas that you know for sure what they are, and that lets the agenda have some sort of triggered ability like we see here, that you wouldn't be able to have otherwise because the agenda's face down. I think a public just in general opens up a lot of design space, and I think there could be some really cool stuff with that in the future. This is pretty much exactly what I'd like to see with 4-for-2 agendas. I'd like to see more 4-for-2s that are broadly playable within their factions. I think the 4-for-2s that we've had in the game so far have been tremendously varied in power level. They've either been extremely good like Nisei Mark II, or they've sat in the box like as long as you've owned the card like Project Ares. So I think that this card is definitely the best 4-for-2 for Wayland. I think really the only one that it's competing with is geothermal fracking. Since you're going to be revealing that it is an agenda with the advancement token, I think you're going to be willing to do the face-up thing without much hesitation. So inasmuch as it's possible to play a 4-for-2 in most Wayland decks, I think this one's really playable. I just don't know how many Wayland decks right now can actually score 4 for 2s and are wanting to do that. So I like this card. I really want to see more Wayland Glacier. That's been one of my main points in all of my reviews, and I think that this card really fits into a Wayland Glacier style really, really well. Next up, we have a new asset for Wayland. This is Corporate Town. It's 0 to res, 5 to trash. It's 2 influence. As an additional cost to res Corporate Town, forfeit an agenda. When your turn begins, you may trash 1 resource, and it cannot be prevented. I think this card has a reasonable amount of playability. It's got a super high trash cost. I think forfeiting an agenda isn't that big of a deal in a faction that has hostile takeover, as well as a 3 for 2 agenda. And it's also got a really strong effect. Trashing resources is going to be really good against basically every runner deck's economy. Whether it's Katie Jones or something like professional contacts or even something like security testing, basically every runner deck has 1 or 2 resources that are central to the way that they play. This is going to be a really mean way to wipe out their resources, and they're not going to even have to be tagged. It also fits really well with decks that already play Executive Boot Camp, because you're going to be able to tutor this thing up if it's going to be good in the situation you're in. And like I said before, forfeiting an agenda seems pretty doable in this faction. So I don't think this card's wildly good, but I could see this being a nice tool for a lot of existing Wayland decks. The last card in the pack is a new neutral piece of ice. It's called Quicksand. It's a 3 to res, 0 strength barrier. It's 0 influence. When the runner encounters Quicksand, place 1 power counter on it. Quicksand has +1 strength for each power counter on it, and has 1 subroutine, which is end the run. Well, if you're playing a taxing style deck, and you have some crap end the run barriers, this could potentially replace them. So I'm thinking things like Baco, or things maybe like Ice Wall, or something like that. If you're playing some bad barriers, like Wall of Static even, this could potentially be better than that. Because if they run it several times, it's going to get pretty big, and it's going to potentially be pretty expensive to deal with. I think that it's got a lot of potential on central servers, because those are the ones that they're going to run the most. Now, it does have some inherent disadvantages. It's going to be 1 strength, so it's gonna likely be dead to Parasite a lot of the time, especially if they're playing Grimoire. And I think maybe it could be a benefit for some decks to play something like Baco or Wall of Static, just because they don't plan on the runner encountering that piece of ice more than 1 time. So I think really this is going to be contingent on you wanting some cheap end the run barrier that's meant to be a taxing type of ice. I don't really see this being good enough as just an end the run barrier for most decks, because most decks already have some good end the run barriers with other positive effects. It's also worth speculating that we've seen a lot of power counter oriented cards lately. So if in the future we get some more ways to either move around power counters or add them to cards, this could potentially be a lot better. Imagine if there was some ID that added power counters to cards in some way or something like that. This could potentially be really good in that kind of deck. This card's okay. It's not mind-blowing, but it is going to be a nice addition to the neutral barriers lineup. And I think that there's a few decks that are going to play 1 or 2 of these. That's going to do it for my Chrome City review. I have to admit that I'm a little bit disappointed in this pack, although I think largely that has to do with the incredible standard set by the last 2 in this cycle. There's definitely a few playables in this pack, and I think that maybe if we see a little bit more of these fringe IDs I've been talking about in this review, we could see some of these cards having a lot more impact than they will initially. So maybe long-term this pack could have a little bit more importance, but I think for now there's going to be a ton of cards that just sit in the box. Well, I hope you liked this review, and if you did, make sure you press the subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you again for some more Netrunner stuff.